This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Dr. Gautam Sen joins me from London today to talk about two important things. One, of course, we'll talk about the hashtag Melody that has really been burning up the internet in the last couple of days. For people who track these things, hashtag Melody, of course, is Giorgia Meloni, and Narendra Modi. So Meloni and Modi makes Melody. Melody, of course, is a famous toffee in India. So there's been a lot of buzz about that. These two leaders taking the relationship of these two countries ahead after many years of a lot of turmoil. We'll talk about that. Of course, we'll talk about what's happening in the British opinion polls. The opinion polls suggest that it's going to be a sort of wipeout for the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party. The Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, is emerging as a strong force. And of course, it might indeed be a Labour government. What does all of that mean? We'll discuss all of this with Gautam Sen. Dr. Sen, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk to begin with, Dr. Sen, about the Melody hashtag. India and Italy has had a difficult relationship for nearly a decade. We all remember the Augusta Westland case where there was a bribery allegation against one of Italy's biggest arms manufacturers. There was the case of the Italian Marines who had, in a sense, they were going to be prosecuted in India, and it created a lot of controversy because they had killed Indian fishermen. And of course, there's a perpetual, controversy in a sense because the de facto leader of India's Congress Party is Sonia Gandhi, who's of Italian origin, and there's a history of controversy about that. But today, Giorgia Meloni and Narendra Modi seems to have taken that relationship in a different direction. We are really experiencing, in a sense, a sort of all-time high in that relationship. Also, a lot of other things are happening behind this popular hashtag. Defense ties are growing, business ties are growing. Talk to us about how this is happening.
I think, the term melody has some merit because there is indeed an evident bonhomie between the two leaders. They quite clearly get on. But I think the real reason for their mutual regard is a political one. Both are nationalist in a sense. They are also committed to reforming their economies and societies. They are pro-marketeers. Like India, Italy also has a very difficult social order to adjust in response to market signals. The unions are very powerful and they have a long tradition, which means that market signals don't work very well to enforce transition. And I think that is a little bit like India too. So they have this ideological convergence. But I think the real story is what's happening in the wider world, which brings them together, their countries finding that they have common interests. Let me first speak from the Indian side. In the case of India, Narendra Modi has really shown himself to be an extraordinary diplomat. And what he is doing, not just in Europe and with regard to Italy, but elsewhere in the Middle East, in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, is to enlarge India's portfolio of relationships and serious engagement. And all of this is there to see, of course, with the most spectacular relationship he has developed with the UAE, and of course, even with Saudi Arabia now, and the very difficult pirouette with regard to Iran while having a strong relationship with Israel. Now, the Italian case is to do with the fact that India really is not wanting to have too many of its eggs in a few baskets. The Indian economy is very dependent on the United States. I think the US is the single biggest trading partner. A huge chunk of India's important information technology exports go to the United States. And India is gradually and slowly expanding the portfolio of political and economic relationships. And this includes countries like Brazil, in Latin America, Indonesia, as we see recently, and many other places. Italy is an interesting case because Italy is a member of NATO and a member of EU, the European Union, which means there are constraints on what it can do in relation to India about trade. Relations with the EU and Italy on trade are basically synchronized. So you cannot have an independent relationship with Italy, but there is enough space to expand many other subsidiary and interconnected relationships. For example, the most important one, which has been discussed in the meeting between Prime Minister Meloni and Prime Minister Modi, is the India Middle East Economic Corridor, which in a way is an alternative to the Chinese BRI initiative. And many countries like this idea. And India, of course, will be the origin of this to start with, and an important trading partner, and a partner whose importance will continue to grow over the next 5-7 years. And it goes via the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and it reaches Europe. And India and Italy have been discussing the importance of this relationship, and both countries are committed to the India Middle East Economic Corridor. This was an important part of the discourse they have been engaging in. And this looks like something which will take time, but it will come to fruition. The other issue they discussed, perhaps not with the most important ally and friend in this regard, is the freedom of the seas in the Indo-Pacific. And in this area, India is enlarging the numbers of partners who are expressing commitment to the sanctity of international law in the Indo-Pacific and freedom of commerce. And of course, the United States plays a paramount role in this area. And there are other countries which are committed, which includes France, Australia, and Italy is an important additional partner. India has also been talking to Italy in a host of areas because although Italy is a medium power, just about, it has important achievements in various areas of science and technology, which is an area of cooperation with India, space, artificial intelligence, clean energy, biofuels. These are all interrelated concerns of both countries, and they have much to gain in cooperating. Bear in mind, any R&D evolved in Italy, which finds a market in India, will immediately reduce its average cost because the size of the market is enlarged. So Italy marketing its intellectual property to India means that it will do it at a lower cost, with India sharing some of that, which is what we have had between India and many other countries, including Russia. So this is a real win-win for both countries. And Italy perhaps has fewer partners and somewhat lesser commitment with China than, say, a country like Germany, which is very deeply engaged in China on economic terms and has much greater difficulty. So Italy can be a significant partner, and Italy also is having, like other European countries, some issues with the functioning of the European Union. Like many other countries, Poland, Hungary, Italy is also asserting its independence. It's taken a distinctive view of the conflict in the Ukraine, which is in some ways closer to that of Hungary and India, that we don't want to worsen the outcome, and we really would like this to end, and we prefer negotiation. So Italy is not saying this aloud because it's a NATO member, but is very reluctant, for example, to use these Italian, Russian assets and to fund the interest from that for the war. They are very reluctant. In fact, I think they are not going to participate. So India and Italy have very similar interests on a range of issues. And most importantly, with India, as with India's many other partners, they really don't have any political rivalry or competition.
There's also an important defense relationship. which we perhaps should refer to, Gautam da.
No, indeed.
Italy still produces some very important armaments, which could be very useful for India.
No, indeed, they have talked about the defense relationship, and I believe an Italian warship, Cavour, I think it is called, is in the Indian ports right now. So the defense relationship is also important. Italian actually has uh, very good technology in submarine manufacture. So there are many areas in which Italy and India find they can cooperate. And this is also an indication that some European Union members want more than what just the European Union can offer. And India clearly is the best partner in the outside world beyond the United States and Japan, if you don't want to get too involved with China. And India, in some ways, is a reliable partner because really India is not geopolitically ambitious. India is a country which seeks to secure its place in its own geographical area. So there are not many issues which will come up in the next 30, 40 years. And there are some cultural similarities. The famous Italian mothers, I think, have much in common with many Indian mothers, whether they're Punjabi or Bengali. They dote on their sons and their grandchildren. So, there is a kind of subterranean cultural familiarity. And now the ICTR is funding a chair in Milan on Indian studies. I hope, for God's sake, they will pick the right person to be the professor of this chair, which has not always happened with ICCR chairs. And critics of India have sometimes got a look in. So this is all for the good, and this is all to do with the fact that India is enlarging its portfolio. Italy is quite an important country, much like France. So this is Indian diplomacy doing very well indeed in so many areas.
Also, some people noted the fact that Prime Minister Meloni chose to put Prime Minister Modi at the center of the frame in the family photograph in G7. Now, of course, India, in a sense, is is a visiting country, so to speak, in the G7. But that is only if you think about the G7 in an old worldly sort of way. In a sense, many people would argue that the G20 today is far more important than the G7. The G7 does not constitute anymore of countries that have a majority of the world's economy, and in fact, not even majority of the world's nuclear weapons. So, in a sense, the G7, needs the global South and a country like India, to booster its own importance.
Absolutely right. I mean, the G7 actually has been losing its luster for some time. And indeed, India was one of the visiting countries, invitees, but clearly the most important one of all the invitees, and also the one which will grow in great importance and rather rapidly. So this was in a way emphasizing the fact that India is the most important country which remains outside the G7, which really ought to be a member. So I think Meloni, possibly with the implicit concurrence of other countries, decided to emphasize India's role. And the fact that India is now articulating the voice of the South in a systematic and determined way adds to India's voice that India will be able to represent other interests beyond its own, which I think has been a terrific achievement of India in the hosting of the G20 in India.
The other thing that has been remarked upon, Dr. Sen, is that, in a sense, Giorgia Meloni represents a move towards a sort of centrist right. Perhaps at one point her party was considered far right in Europe, but today, most people would consider, especially ever since she's taken power, she's moved more to the center right. And when we see the results of the European elections, Europe itself, or vast parts of Europe, seems to be shifting right. There are many reasons for this. Some are economic, some, of course, are cultural. There's a crisis of immigration that's going on. There's also a crisis of the fear of radical Islamism, especially after the scenes that many Europeans saw on their streets after the war in Gaza. There's a whole bunch of reasons, but Europe is shifting right. And in a sense, Narendra Modi represents, in a sense, sort of, I don't believe the right and left terminology really works in India, but from an European gaze, he would be center right, so to speak. So there's also an ideological affinity of a sort. At the very least, both these two leaders have a particular, conservative point of view, especially in social matters and other matters.
Well, illegal immigration has become a very big issue in Europe, and that is what is causing this public backlash in France, in Germany, and with countries like Hungary and Poland refusing to accept EU policy and their quota of the asylum seekers. And in fact, Hungary is threatened with very big fines on a daily basis. So this issue of immigration has pushed the politics of Europe to the right. It is doing that even in England now with the rise of the Reform Party. So this is a general shift to the whole issue. And for Italy, there have been arrivals which exceed the total population of towns within 2-3 days. So this is something which no politician can ignore. So in that sense, India has a not very dissimilar problem with huge illegal migrants. So there is mutual understanding that these are issues we have to face. But also there is a kind of other question in the background. When the European Union was formed with Monnet, it was an economic union. But over time, and particularly the last 2 decades, an important section of the European elites have sought a high degree of social and political integration and even cultural cohesion. And this has not been acceptable to much of the population. They find it unfamiliar, and this has become mixed up with a secular view of European culture that is evolving. And this secular view includes a kind of multiculturalism that the Europeans are not finding acceptable. Because this culturalism actually has somehow become joined up with Islam. And this really is not working at all. And we see this very much in France because France is now a deeply divided society with almost half the population backing Marine Le Pen. In Germany, Chancellor Scholz has suffered a serious setback in the European elections, and this will now be reflected in the elections which have been called by President Macron in France. So a lot of important things are happening, and Europe in itself as an entity is facing a great deal of uncertainty. The one other issue which people don't seem to have taken on board, the creation of the euro has damaged the economies of all countries except Germany. It has been devastating for countries like Greece and Italy because German productivity has been growing up by about 2% per year, which means German products are becoming more competitive every year, and cumulatively, this really means a lot. In normal circumstances, if you did not have a fixed exchange rate, your exchange rate would adjust to reflect the cost differential. But since now you're in a fixed exchange rate, you are unable to compete because your products are becoming progressively more expensive, and your society has to adjust its cost structure in order to cope with the competition from Germany. Now, that social adjustment is very difficult in India and Italy, as I just mentioned, that you have to really change the pension system, the employment system, the long holidays. It means a huge change which people are not willing to accept, even in France. So all of this has come together at a time which the immigration issue has turned into a crisis.
You noted the social conservativeness by talking about religion. Of course, this G7 also saw for the first time attendance by the incumbent Pope.
In a way, in a conservative country, the Pope will obviously have greater prominence. And in a way, this is an assertion of Italy's historic past, because the Pope was, in a sense, the center of the universe for a very, very long time. And the prominence accorded to the Pope, in a way, is also a cultural assertion, a reminder of its historic role, and it is consistent with Giorgia Meloni's overall political stance. But bear in mind what you just said earlier is also true. When you're in power, you move a bit closer to the center. So the rough edges of Meloni, which were deemed extremist, now seem quite reasonable, which is something I'm sure will happen with Marine Le Pen, though I get the feeling she's a little bit more militant and their immigration problems are much more serious. But
No, but
there
it's
is a
already
shift.
happened with Marie Le Pen. I mean, remember the history of her party is that, in a sense, she left behind the radical past of her party, and in fact, her own father, to recraft the party in a more centrist mold. And that's how she's come where she's reached today. It's not the same party. It's not the same party of her father. That party had, really rough edges. Marine Le Pen has moved far away from that.
No, absolutely. I mean, her father was really quite hardline, and Marie Le Pen self-consciously shifted away from that, and in a way, that is an explanation for her increased popularity. And Meloni actually has become quite mellow now in many ways. Even on the immigration issue, she has taken on board the complex practicalities of dealing with this, though the problem is very serious in Italy. And if you go to many Italian cities, even Florence, where I was not long ago, they are unrecognizable, and it makes you sit up when you see how much of the change has come. One of the few places I've been to which were relatively unchanged was Bologna. A place like Rome and Milan, not Milan so much, but Florence. So these societies are undergoing huge change and they are not comfortable. And now this is something which we are seeing in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, let's
And
talk about the UK then. It's time now we talk about the UK. Rather seismic shifts were happening in the UK too. After what 14 years of conservative rule, opinion polls just out suggest that the Conservative Party is headed for a dramatic and historic rout. In the upcoming polls, which, by the way, and many conservative commentators are talking about this. Rishi Sunak called early. Many people would have thought that he would allow the economy to settle down, incomes to rise, and then call for election. But he's called an early election, quite like Macron. And now it seems, at least the opinion polls suggest, that the Conservatives will be routed out. Not only be routed out, they might actually, in many places, come third after the newfangled Reform Party led by the notorious Nigel Farage.
well, he called the election early because he was thinking that things are not going to get much better in a few months' time, and he must have all the projections for the economy, and that's really what counted. And he thought he would call it quickly before the Reform Party, which was a serious threat, could get organized to fight the elections. But clearly, public sentiment was so against him that it made no difference. And so, in a way, the calculations backfired. The most serious poll says the Conservatives will reduce to 72 seats, and an internal party poll says 60. This will be unprecedented. The Labour Party will end up with a majority numbers exceeding 400. It is unthinkable. And it is also being said, even though reform, because of the first past the post system, won't be able to get more seats, the Tories, they may end up getting more votes in absolute numbers than the Tories. Now, that too is somewhat earth shattering for the first time in the history of the Tories. I have to say, Mr. Rishi Sunak has played all this very badly. He isn't a popular politician. He seems to lack a popular touch. And it appears he has not been well advised on many issues. He has made far too many faux pas. For example, leaving early from the D-Day ceremony caused a lot of upset in the country. People have a huge respect for the armed forces and their past role. And for the prime minister to have left when nobody else did has gone down very badly. He was ill advised to do that. He also said something strange on television in an interview when he was asked that if he had a difficult childhood, didn't have everything, what was it that he lacked in his childhood? For quite a few moments, he could not answer. And then he said, well, we didn't have Sky TV at home. This also did not go down well. So all of these have conspired to cause public disenchantment. In fairness to Rishi Sunak, it should be borne in mind he inherited a truly poisoned chalice. What he inherited as prime minister was really a very bad situation for the economy, thanks to the insane policies of the preceding prime minister Liz Truss. So it was a no-win situation for him, no matter what he did, because he would have had to make, and he had to make, the British people swallow a bitter pill on the economic front. However, it would be well worth recalling, which a very distinguished journalist and former Member of Parliament, Matthew Paris, recorded in an article, a list of Mr. Sunak's achievements after he became Prime Minister. And there were quite a few where errors of the past were repaired. For example, the relationship with France after Boris Johnson was at a low. And Mr. Sunak did a great deal to repair that relationship. The Northern Ireland situation was precarious. And that's a very serious question for the British Isles. And that too was resolved by Rishi Sunak. And there are numbers of other areas. And he also reset the economy. Yes, taxes are at an all-time high, and people are feeling the pain and they're angry, and they should well be. But really, that was not Mr. Sunak's fault. And there was not a
Dr.
lot he
Sen,
could do.
or many, people who think in these terms believe that essentially conservative party bosses, the old white conservative party bosses, so to speak, dons, essentially handed what you movingly called a poison chalice to basically an Indian man of Indian origin, so that he will sink. It's under his watch that the party will go down as having recorded its worst ever electoral performance. Do you think there is any truth to that?
Well, it is absolutely correct. And no matter what people say, in popular memory, he will be held responsible because he is, after all, the prime minister. So there is no escaping this. Thoughtful people may understand different, but by and large, people will say this happened under his watch and he will carry the can. But, he was made prime minister by the City of London. The economic crisis in the bond market was so bad that major pension funds, including the USS, the biggest pension fund in the UK, that is the University Teachers Pension Fund, they had suffered huge losses and things were looking very bad. Some were threatened with collapse. And the city basically told the Tory hierarchy that we trust this man and we want him to be prime minister because of his background as the exchequer, and they knew him and they knew he had the relevant training background from Stanford. And so they made the Tory hierarchy create a voting system where you needed 100 party votes to even stand. And that, in a way, finessed the election in his favor. So that, I think, is how it came about that Mr. Rishi Sunak became prime minister. Quite clearly, he has a desire to do the right thing. He is not to blame for the fact that he doesn't have a popular touch. You either have it or you don't. But it may well be that he will be replaced just before the election by somebody who might rally the voters to prevent the disaster from getting any worse. And my bet is on the Speaker of the House, the ebullient Penny Mordaunt, who is a great debater, is very plausible. And I think she has a lot of popular support. So maybe she will replace him just before the election. But let's wait and see, because things are going bad to worse on a daily basis. And the Labour Party coming to power is not going to cure anything at all. The economic situation is very dire. They have published a manifesto in which they are saying they will raise £7.5 billion in additional revenue. For example, curtailing the privileges of non-doms, imposing VAT on private school fees, and a number of other issues, which will raise tiny amount. The total revenue of this country is £1 trillion. 7.5 billion is a very tiny amount, and they have outlined how they will spend it. It clearly will not be enough. They will not be able to spend very much. They are going to be hemmed in, and there'll be a lot of frustration in the backbenches, particularly from the left. They will have union trouble. Many people who have seen their living standards fall, not least the very powerful junior doctors who really have suffered quite a lot in recent years. Teachers, another important union, because if the schools shut down, the economy shuts down. Powerful transport workers' unions, and a number of others. All of these will be restless very quickly, and sweet talking them will not be easy. So they will be in trouble. So they will have to try and raise extra revenue. And though Rachel Reeves, the future Chancellor of the Exchequer, is saying we are not going to do this or that, there's every chance they will meddle with pensions. For example, your accumulated pension in SIP, the self-invested personal pension, is exempted from inheritance tax. There's an upper limit. That's a big amount of money. They would be very tempted to bring that into the inheritance tax net. They may also reduce the tax relief on pension contributions to the basic 20 rather than 20, 40, and 45, depending on your income. Well, that's a big amount of money. They may also integrate the low capital gains tax with income. At the moment, capital gains, say, in the equities is 10%. For income tax, it is again 20, 40, 45. So they might say, depending on your income, you'll pay 20, 40, and 45. They may also increase the taxes on second homes, which are currently 18 and 24. They may say also that will be subject to the same rates as income tax. This will be a very severe blow to the middle class. But it may come to that. There'll be grave discontent, and yet they may be obliged to embark on some of these radical measures. Will the economy recover? The problem for the economy is the following. The debt GT ratio is 100. And the interest payment on that is between 4 and 4.5%. The economy is growing at less than 0.5%. So the service payments on your debt have to come out of taxation, current consumption, and that depresses demand. That makes people unhappy. That's what's happening now. So how they get out of this bind is a difficult question to answer. How difficult? The other problem, which they have inflicted on themselves, they left Brexit without giving it serious thought. This is something which can be laid at the door of Lord Cameron, who is the current Foreign Secretary. He made a promise to the Tory right wing he'd hold a referendum on Brexit. You have to ask him, when the consequences of the referendum are so big, do you put this to a vote? It's like saying, I'm going to risk something which may result in nuclear war. This is a matter on which you take no risk because the consequences are too great to put this to a vote. Because if you lose, you don't lose a little, you lose everything. Now, Boris Johnson played the populist card for all it is worth, shamelessly, and he won the Brexit vote by a margin of less than 1%, 0.75%. The consequence is that the economy is losing 100 billion pounds per annum, 1% of GDP. This is a serious amount of money. So leaving the European economy has caused huge economic chaos. It is very difficult to export. The amount of red tape is great. Going to Europe as a tourist is a nightmare. So these are all things they brought on themselves. In addition, the world economy has slowed down. So the prospects of Britain exporting itself out of difficulty is much more difficult. The Americans, for their own reasons, have said no free trade is on the cards for the United Kingdom. So they are now hoping India will ride to the rescue, just as the East India Company did ride to the rescue of Britain.
So that was going to be my last part of the conversation and my last question, Dr. Sen. You pertinently point out that the British economy is in grave crisis, and labor or no labor, this cannot be fixed tomorrow. and a reintegration, as some people hope, immediately with Europe once again, is not that easy. It cannot happen very quickly and easily. So this pain will linger. What would it mean? What would a Labour government in these circumstances mean for India-British ties? The long-awaited FTA hasn't come through. Some people said it would come through before Diwali last year. It hasn't happened. I think very wisely the Indians, and led by Prime Minister Modi, essentially delayed it, and are going through tough rounds of negotiations, which I think is the right thing to do, because not all everybody is convinced that that's the right path for India to go to and have a free trade agreement with the UK. So how will it impact India-British ties? Also remember, and this is my last part, Indian FDI has fallen significantly, and some critics say one of the reasons it has fallen is because India wiped out a lot of its old FTAs and started renegotiating FTAs all over again, free trade agreements all over again. So, in such a scenario, in a sense, isn't it true that India also needs a big FTA win? Talk us through this.
Well, just to make a quick comment on Britain rejoining the European Union, they will have to really eat humble pie. They will really have to accept some humiliation. But I think if this were to happen, it would not be based on emotion and sentiment from the European side. They would make a careful economic calculation. And Britain is still a very large economy. The biggest market for German cars was the United Kingdom. So this cannot be ruled out. The Indian FTA, I should, with some hesitation, say there are very senior people, senior economists in India who are skeptical. An Indian ambassador to the WTO and a senior economist wrote, I think 18 months ago, advising against it. And there are many pitfalls for India. For example, there are new sectors in high-tech areas which will immediately face British competition. And they would be harmed because Britain does have the advantage of being the first mover in many of these areas. So Indian high-tech sectors could be harmed. Secondly, many third countries will invest in the United Kingdom to use it as a platform into India. What will India say if Chinese investment enters the United Kingdom into the service sector, where it is very difficult to impose rules of origin, very difficult. And products actually originating in China come through the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom hopes there will be inward investment to take advantage of the Indian market. And bear in mind, the Indian market is going to keep growing to $7 trillion in the next 5-7 years. So the UK is not just thinking about next year, it's thinking about the medium and long-term future. And the Indian market will be a huge blessing. There are also some calculations which show most of the products in which India will enjoy better access already have relatively free access. The only area in which it would gain somewhat is clothing. Indian textiles don't face as many barriers, but because India has lost its least developed status for clothing, it faces tariff, I think, of 18% compared to, say, Bangladesh, which means India will be in a more competitive position. But I would like to ask my friends in the Commerce Ministry and in the MEA, do you want Bangladesh to lose market share to you and have many more millions of Bangladeshis wanting to come into India because the economy is in trouble? Clothing is the lifeblood of Bangladesh. It would not be wise to outcompete Bangladesh by India. Besides, the UK market won't be so huge. That is the one area where India would gain, but it is not clear if you go item by item what India would gain. There is an argument going on, and that has been one of the barriers to the signing, is the right of Indian professionals to enter to service, for example, in IT, the UK. And the UK is finding this very difficult because there's a big anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. And the largest single group of immigrants in the world who come to the UK last year, the year before, and the year before are all from India, are all Indians. So there is a political problem over here. Bear in mind also, India is the second largest investor in the United Kingdom. And would India, in the context of a free trade agreement wish to lose chunks of its pharmaceuticals, some of which have already started moving into the United Kingdom? Would they wish to lose these industries which are so important? Because there would be no difference to being in India or the UK. In fact, being in the UK might be an advantage in selling to third markets because it would have somewhat superior regulatory approval from the UK regulator. So there are many issues that Indians must think about very carefully before they sign up to FTA. My feeling is that these leading economists in government are very cognizant of all these issues, and the government will get appropriate advice. So India will strive to maintain good relations, but there is a problem. The Labour Party will be beholden to a very strong lobby of Pakistani origin. They are able to decide the outcome in 80 to 100 seats by being the swing vote. And these people are very well organized. They listen very carefully to what the Pakistan embassy tells them. And the most important thing is that voters do what the mosques and the madrasas tell them to. They are united. I think no Indian will be surprised at this. And there will be a lot of pressure on the British government to sanction India, make unwelcome statements. And if there are incidents in J&K, or indeed even a clash with Pakistan, there would be trouble. They will demand stop the supply of these Rolls-Royce engines we are buying. We have a very important relationship. And these are things we should cultivate and not lose. In this engine area, it's very important for us. Britain also has very advanced laser technology. All of these things we should strive to gain. But what will happen to the government if there are demonstrators stoning the High Commission? When you have to take harsh action, they will be facing dilemmas. Most governments won't wish to countenance this kind of violence and difficulty, but they are prisoners. And if numbers of MPs lose this time, because many British Muslims are angry about Palestine, and already the deputy leader has publicly eaten a humble pie, apologized for not having a strong enough stance on Palestine and Gaza. So this is something the Indians will have to watch out for. And I do believe the government of India has enough experience with the UK to be aware of all these things. And it should be wary of giving hostage to fortune. The UK needs India. India can manage without it. India is the one big economy in the last 60 years which has advanced on its own steam. Singapore, Taiwan, Korea were helped to get ahead by the United States. All the capital investment in Korea and Taiwan in the 60s came gratis from the United States. The Chinese grew by gaining unlimited access to the American market for products they could dump at will. That is how China's economy grew so fast, because of access to export markets. India has grown on its own steam without any of this help. And indeed, it is facing a degree of hostility because it seems a second major Asian economy is causing a degree of unease in the West. So India will have to manage by itself. I have to say that this government, despite so many constraints, having to meet so many challenges, has done exceptionally well. And one must wish it well in the next 5 years. And we have a very good team managing our affairs.
All right, Gautam Sen, fascinating insight into what's going to happen in Europe with the India-Italy relationship. Also very critically in the UK, as the Conservatives, at least according to opinion polls, head towards a catastrophic defeat and perhaps a Labour government soon in the UK. What would all of this mean for India? Thanks very much for your explanations and your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.